Hey everybody, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to the dark side of RFK Jr. We are reading Jerry Oppenheimer's incredible book, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the Dark Side of the Dream. But before we get back into that, this chapter, the next couple of chapters that we're going to read, talk about how his marriage, which seemed like a beautiful and perfect marriage to Emily Black, fell apart and why. And the sex addiction, even though in the previous chapter we read about his heroin addiction and addictions to other drugs and alcohol that he did kick successfully, but the other addiction, the sex addiction, apparently he is not cured of. If you keep up with RFK Jr., you know there's always some new scandal in the papers every few months of women that have accused him of sexual assault and sexual harassment. And so some new reporting this week, actually, from Mediaite exclusively. It's a woman who worked with him at Children's Health Defense. That's the nonprofit organization that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. works with, apparently accused him of sexual misconduct and was paid almost $1 million settlement as part of a non-disclosure agreement. This happened in late 2020, according to multiple sources. And the reason that this came out, it's all part of the Senate confirmation process. After his initial public hearings, senators followed up with some written questions that they wanted answers to. In his written answers, he admitted, under questioning from Senate Democrats, to 2 separate misconduct claims against him, which he has kept quiet through these confidentiality and NDA agreements. He declined to inform the Senate of any details of those agreements, including how much he paid to his accusers and what exactly he was being accused of. He said, quote, "Twice I have been targeted by frivolous, unfounded allegations, which I strenuously denied at the time and continue to deny." That's what he said in response to questions from Democrats about the sum and the nature of those agreements. He said, quote, "I entered into confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements to prohibit those individuals from continuing to make these allegations." Those allegations against Robert Kennedy were unknown until they came to the attention of Senate Democrats after he was asked in this series of written questions whether he had ever reached any confidential monetary settlements with anyone accusing him of misconduct. Kennedy replied that he had, which prompted further questions from these Senate Democrats. As you probably know, Bobby Kennedy has faced several allegations of sexual misconduct. Last July, Eliza Cooney, a woman who he employed as a babysitter for his children in the late 1990s, accused him publicly of multiple instances of sexual misconduct, including groping her against her will on more than one occasion, and reading her diary and sneaking into her bedroom and asking her to rub lotion on his back and all kinds of crazy stuff. Kennedy claimed not to remember the incident, and then he was asked directly, I believe it was by Senator Patty Murray of Washington. She asked him about it in his Senate confirmation hearings, and he he said that the whole story had been debunked, which I have never seen it debunked anywhere. It doesn't appear to be debunked. And so she questioned him further because that answer was just kind of squirrely. And he said that, she's like, "But you texted Eliza Cooney an apology," which he did. And that apology was published in the media. He said, "Oh, I was actually apologizing to her for something else, not of the groping and the touching that was inappropriate." So Eliza Cooney was then interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. They went to Eliza to get her reaction to what Kennedy had said, because basically under oath, he called her a liar. And, saying that the story was debunked. So Eliza Cooney then responded in the Wall Street Journal saying, quote, "Kennedy showed today that he still lacks character. He flat out lied to the committee." So that's her take on it. And, on this settlement agreement, I don't know what happened. I wasn't there, but I can tell you this. Men accused of any kind of sexual assault or sexual misconduct usually don't pay $1 million if they're innocent. So, that being said, let's talk about how this destroyed 2 of his previous marriages. It is well known, of course, that Bobby's infidelity is what caused the end of his marriage to Emily Black, which you'll hear in today's episode. And that led him to marry his old friend, Mary Richardson, whom he'd known for many years. She was another kind of Kennedy hanger-on, who he got pregnant while he was cheating on Emily with her. And when they got married, Mary was already 6 months pregnant. That's a very interesting story, and we're going to tell it in this episode of The Dark Side of RFK Jr. And, ready or not, RFK Jr. is now your new Secretary of Health and Human Services. Over the objections of the Democrats, who filibustered and held the floor for 30 hours in opposition to RFK Jr.'s nomination overnight Wednesday. They were on the floor making speeches well past midnight in protest of this nomination, but they had the votes. The Republicans had the votes. And so on Thursday morning, he was confirmed. The vote was 52-48 along party lines. Senator Mitch McConnell, former Republican majority leader, also a survivor of polio, he was the sole Republican joining the Democrats to vote against Kennedy. So that same day, shortly thereafter, we saw Robert Kennedy being sworn in by Neil Gorsuch in the Oval Office with President Trump. He made some remarks, and he had his family there with him, or some members of his family. He had his wife, third wife, actress Cheryl Hines, and 2 of his children, and 2 of his daughters. And something really struck me when I was watching that, and I want to show you a photograph. If you're watching the video version of this podcast, I'll just put it on the screen for you. You'll see his daughter, Kathleen Kennedy, his eldest. And of course, she's the daughter from his first marriage to Emily Black. She looks for the world like Emily Black. The resemblance is just astonishing. I always thought she was a spitting image of Emily. And then you see next to her, Kyra Kennedy, who's one of his daughters with his second wife, Mary Richardson, the late Mary Richardson, who took her life in 2012. But, you know, I've watched Kyra grow up, and she's a beautiful young lady. She's actually a model, just absolutely gorgeous. But, you know, she looks so much like her late mother. It's astonishing. It's like seeing Mary's ghost when you look at her. So when you look at this photograph, you see Bobby standing there with his wife and his 2 daughters. But his 2 daughters, you know, they're grown up. And I just couldn't help but be taken aback by, it looked like he was standing there with all 3 of his wives. Strange to see. It was like he was standing there with Emily, Mary, and Cheryl. It was very strange to look at. And if you're familiar with his family, you're familiar with what his wives looked like, and you know the whole story, it was downright spooky. And of course, there's kind of a spooky end to all of this. And we're going to jump back into the book. Where did we leave off? We're on chapter 27 now. And if you are reading along with me in the hardback edition of Jerry Oppenheimer's book, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream, today we're going to jump back in at page 276. Chapter 27, Quickie Divorce. While Bobby Kennedy Jr. may have fallen in love with the Hudson River, he had fallen out of love with his wife, Emily. Above and beyond Bobby's hellish drug problem, Emily had her own issue, transforming her Indiana-born and bred natural style into being the model, exuberant Kennedy wife, like her mother-in-law, the rah-rah Ethel. Emily, as a close family source later maintained, was more like Jackie than she was Ethel. The Ethel-Jackie relationship, or lack thereof, had surfaced even before they became sisters-in-law. When the young Kennedys would get together on Saturday afternoons in Georgetown to play touch football, Jackie would sit bored and glum on the sidelines while Ethel tangled with the guys. Ethel made jokes that Jackie wouldn't play because she was afraid to smear her makeup, one of the other women cattily recalled. I remember Ethel, who rarely wore lipstick, shaking her head in wonderment, saying, "Jackie thinks she's a queen. I can't figure out what Jack sees in her." That's sort of the way the Kennedys and Bobby felt about Emily towards the end of their marriage, according to family sources. While Emily wasn't competing with a difficult sister-in-law, she felt overwhelmed by the whole boisterous Kennedy gang, and it only got worse as the years passed. A close friend recalled seeing Emily at Kennedy family events and noticed how she tried to just become invisible. She was the shy, retiring type who didn't want to jump in and play sports. She didn't want to become competitive with all of them. In that respect, she had a fish-out-of-water quality about her because she was all so nice and genuine. Emily wasn't really into being a Kennedy, but she loved Bobby and their home and their kids. Once Bobby went through rehab and got clean from the drugs, was regularly attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and was working with the Hudson River Keeper, things got better for a time. Having RFK III and Kick had helped because Bobby, from a family of 11, and Emily, from just 2 siblings, wanted lots of kids. The problem was, Bobby was a difficult guy to be married to in general, said a close confidant, confidentially. He was always on the go, always doing things, always had people around him, and he always had people who wanted something from him and people who were offering him stuff. He was always out, summers at the Cape, traveling out in the wilderness. He was always just taking off. When he was on drugs, he was wired, and when he was off drugs, he was wired. When Bobby wasn't on the go, he had turned their home in Mount Kisco into a veritable party house, like the mansion in which he had been raised, Hickory Hill. And life at Hickory Hill had been modeled by Bobby's mother on the Skakel estate, where she had grown up in Greenwich, where there were endless rounds of business parties, socializing, carousing, and lots of drinking. There was always an open house on weekends in Mount Kisco, said a friend of Bobby and Emily's. On any given weekend, you never knew who was going to be out at that house. It was always a gathering point for fun, for interesting people, for pain-in-the-ass people, every kind of people. But it just wasn't easy for Emily. Bobby was much more social than Emily. Before the divorce, and even before the separation, they began to drift apart. These two realized they weren't ideally suited for each other. It became clear over time that their marriage just wasn't going to work out, and they were figuring out how best to end it. Still, Bobby publicly made their lives together sound perfect. As he once boasted to People magazine, "Emily and I go out every Wednesday night. No matter what, we have a date. Then we spend 2 nights a week at home with the kids. On Tuesday night, I babysit and she goes out. On Monday night, I go out and she babysits." He said he awakened every morning at sunrise, fed his animals, ran 3 miles, and then helped Emily get the kids ready for school, painting himself as the perfect husband and father. By 1990, the 8th year of their troubled marriage, when RFK III was 6 and Kick was 2, Emily decided to return to her career as a lawyer, at least on a part-time basis. She and her longtime friend and roommate from law school, Alexandra Curie, shared an office in downtown Manhattan, but Emily worked mostly from home. Her off-and-on legal practice would continue for about 5 years until after she and Bobby split. More serious than the parties at their home in Mount Kisco was Bobby's womanizing, and Emily knew what was going on, a close source revealed years later to this author, Jerry Oppenheimer. The source said, confidentially, whatever relationships Bobby had, he had. and people were aware of it. Emily definitely knew. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but there wasn't a lot of fighting about it. There wasn't a lot of acrimonious finger-pointing. When his namesake, RFK III, was 8 years old and his daughter Kik was 4 in 1992, Bobby separated from Emily, who had been a loyal, loving Kennedy wife who had helped see him through his addiction and who had and would remain tight-lipped about the hellishness and the good times of their union. As a friend observed, quote, "Emily's always been very protective of Bobby. She has always handled that stuff with grace and class. She'd always say to me, 'Go easy on him.' Emily was never bitter about the separation or the divorce, and she didn't fight it. It was a relief for both of them." Bobby had taken up with a glamorous, stylish brunette, Mary Richardson, a longtime friend of his sister Carrie's, whom he'd known from the time she was 14. But it wasn't until 1993, when he ran into Mary at an art gallery, that they began a relationship. On a trip to Ireland in the summer of 1993, Bobby proposed to her, and they began planning their wedding, which would take place 9 months later after she was pregnant. In a sworn affidavit filed in New York Supreme Court some years later, involving his plans to divorce her for another woman, Bobby acknowledged that he, quote, "fell deeply in love with Mary in 1993. At the time," he said, "I was in the process of finalizing a separation agreement with my first wife of 11 years, Emily Black, with whom I had been estranged for over a year." However, when Bobby actually proposed to Mary in the Emerald Isle, he led her and others close to her to believe that he was already divorced from Emily. According to a source familiar with the situation, it's believed that Mary learned the truth from Bobby around the time that she became pregnant. And I'm going to stop right there because there's actually new information that's come to light since this book was published. Oppenheimer's book was published in 2015. And then last year, a new book came out by Maureen Callahan. And that book is called Ask Not, The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. And the author, Maureen Callahan, spoke to Mary's siblings. I think she spoke to 3 of Mary's siblings, interviewed them at length. And she actually clarified this story. Sadly, it's even worse than we thought. Apparently, from the time that Bobby started dating Mary, from the time they met again at that art gallery around 1992, he had told her the whole time that he was divorced. So she was dating him under the impression that he was available. Turns out he was not divorced. He didn't tell her that until after he had proposed, and she had said yes, and after he'd gotten her pregnant. And only then did he actually tell Mary the truth, that he was not actually divorced yet. Which must have been very difficult for Mary because by all accounts, she was a very strict Catholic, practicing Catholic. And here she was carrying the baby of a man who was married to someone else. So she had committed adultery, and I think that weighed heavily on her mind. So what a way to start a marriage, huh? Okay, back to the book. Bobby's anxiety level had presumably skyrocketed with his marital issues. That was underscored when he accidentally nearly crippled a woman. The incident happened about 6:30 p.m. on May 9th, 1992, when Bobby, driving Emily's minivan, ran over New York attorney Mary Wallace Anderson's foot as she was trying to get into the vehicle in a parking lot in Garrison, New York, where his Riverkeeper organization was holding its annual Shad Festival. Anderson was there at the invitation of one of her closest friends, Jane Fleetwood. That's the wife of Bobby's longtime pal, Harvey Blake Fleetwood. Also in the car was Bobby's son, RFK III. According to a lawsuit Anderson's lawyer, David Gould, filed on September 9th, 1993, seeking $1 million, she claimed to have suffered, quote, serious and severe injuries to her foot, the painful severing of a nerve that required hospitalization, caused by Bobby's, quote, carelessness and recklessness and negligence. Looking back on the case some years later, Gould said, quote, it was a run-of-the-mill type accident. There was a bunch of people in the car and she was getting in. He somehow got the feeling that everybody was in, and somebody yelled, wait, don't go, but he didn't hear that and backed up, and the wheel went over her foot. It really impacted her life. He dropped her off at the hospital the same day. It was a simple open and shut accident, and there was no real fight over damages that there usually is, but it sort of went the other way. It was very strange. It got very, very contentious. His own lawyer was telling me, don't let him affect you. We should just get this case resolved. Bobby's attorney, Joel Annuzzi, assigned by Bobby's insurer, Travelers Insurance, recalled that Bobby had been confrontational, controversial, and had an attitude. Quote, there was definitely a touch of arrogance about the way he spoke and acted. What started off lovely didn't end up lovely. I thought this was going to be a simple case, but it got a lot more involved because Kennedy didn't want to say what we all thought he was going to say, said Mary Anderson's attorney. Says, quote, the guy's a real fuck. He just had this attitude of shove it up your ass. He couldn't believe that somebody would ever bring a case against him because he's a Kennedy. It's his entitlement. In his deposition, according to another well-placed source, Bobby claimed that he was not negligent. When Anderson read Bobby's deposition, she was said to have been shocked and couldn't believe how he had twisted the facts. It got to be very contentious, Anderson's lawyer said, complaining that it should have been a simple case. Quote, their doctor found the same thing our doctor found. We weren't arguing over damages. She had a really bad nerve injury. But Kennedy was trying to intimidate me by accusing me of mistreating his son during the deposition. It was pure bullshit. He was saying things to me that I just couldn't believe. Things like, you're trapping me, aren't you? You're trying to trap me. I've been up against the nastiest people in my career, but there were some things regarding him that I was just upset about. My take on him was negative, negative, negative. Because a settlement couldn't be reached, a trial date was set for around the time The River Keepers was due to be published. The cable network, Court TV, which covered high-profile cases, had its cameras and reporters ready. But, as the victim's lawyer, Mr. Gould, noted, there was no way in hell Kennedy was going to let this go to trial. At the last minute, a settlement was reached. On Thursday, March 24th, 1994, just days before Bobby and Emily's 12th wedding anniversary, he flew out of New York City and into the city of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic for a 9 a.m. hearing to obtain a quickie divorce. The law there permitted foreigners who arrived by the thousands annually to end marriages in just a few hours. It was also a place where divorce records were difficult to find, a way to keep nosy investigators and journalists from snooping, and were merely handwritten entries in a civil registry office book. Moreover, the records weren't in alphabetical order and usually required the services of a local lawyer who knew his or her way around in order to find any discrete information. But Bobby's hope of keeping the divorce a secret from the world was dashed when the local daily newspaper reported it, and then the story was picked up by the Associated Press and given wide coverage. In Emily's hometown, the local paper's headline a few days later blared, "Bloomington Marriage of the 80s, Black Kennedy Ends in Divorce." At the moment his divorce was ratified in the Caribbean nation, his girlfriend back at home, Mary Richardson, was 6 months pregnant with Bobby's baby. When Bobby and Emily initially separated, a close friend maintained Richardson wasn't the primary reason. Quote, Bobby left Emily for a new life, and Mary was a part of that, but it wasn't like a quid pro quo. It wasn't like he was replacing Emily with Mary. It wasn't like Bobby suddenly came to Emily and said, "I'm in love with Mary now." But Mary was always around. She was pretty close to everyone in the Kennedy family. She was Carrie Kennedy's best friend and spent a lot of time with them over the years. I know she liked being a part of the Kennedys. She liked the social acceptance, and she liked to be a part of something bigger and more interesting. She liked the patina of the Kennedys. She was into that more than Emily ever was. In Bobby's divorce settlement with Emily, she got very little but the basics from her multimillionaire husband, an heir to the billion-dollar Kennedy fortune. The woman who went through hell and back with him was said to have received half of the value of their Mount Kisco home and was permitted to stay there until she remarried and moved to Washington, D.C. about a year after the divorce. Emily also received an undisclosed amount of alimony that was surrendered when she remarried, and child support that was adjusted down with her new marriage. She also got joint custody. Under the agreement, the couple's children, RFK III and Kik, spent 2 weekends each month with Bobby and his second wife, Mary Richardson, and most of it every summer at the Kennedy compound on the Cape. There was one other demand made of Emily. As part of the custody agreement, she was not permitted to move beyond a 50-mile radius of Mount Kisco, a condition that was removed when the child support amount was adjusted downward following her second marriage. 40-year-old Bobby had become one of the first members of the Kennedy clan to be divorced since his uncle Ted, who was 50 when he filed for divorce just before Christmas 1982 from his 48-year-old wife, Joan. In the senator's case, an irretrievable breakdown in their marriage was cited as the official reason. In Bobby's case, he was granted what was known in the Dominican Republic as a mutual consent divorce. It meant he didn't have to prove a cause for ending his union with Emily. He just needed her mutual agreement, which she was said to have gladly given. She wanted out of the marriage just as much as he did. Unlike Bobby, who had surreptitiously flown to the Dominican Republic to get a divorce in secret, Ted and Joan Kennedy ended their union openly in Barnstable, Massachusetts, during a half-hour session in the court clerk's office and with a reporter actually taking notes nearby. Under state law, their divorce became final a year later, with pregnant Mary Richardson waiting for him to make her an honest woman. Bobby's divorce was instantaneous. It had been Ted Kennedy who had recommended that Bobby finalize his divorce in the Dominican Republic because the Kennedy family had a close friend in residence there who could be available if needed and possibly ease the way if necessary. That friend was present at the start of Bobby's marriage and nearby when the divorce papers were signed. He was Father Jerry Creedon, who had co-officiated at Bobby and Emily's nuptials in Bloomington. The Reverend Terry Ewing, who had co-officiated with Creedon at the Kennedy Black wedding, recalled years later that he had heard that Bobby had sought an annulment so that he could be married in the Catholic Church the next time around. Gossip about the marriage being annulled was rife in the press and among people who knew Bobby and Emily. It was really sad to hear that, said Ewing, because at that point Bobby and Emily had 2 children. And under the Catholic doctrine, when marriages are annulled, the marriage doesn't exist anymore, so the children don't exist. When a marriage is annulled, those people are erased. In 2013, however, Father Creedon said he was unaware that Bobby had been granted any annulment. He said, "But it's possible. I participated in the pre-marriage preparation, but I was not involved in the divorce." And he claimed he didn't even know that Bobby had obtained his divorce in the Dominican Republic, where Creedon was stationed at the time. Explaining that his relationship with the Kennedy family is quite confidential, he added, "I'm always disappointed when a marriage doesn't work out." Along with being Ethel Kennedy's spiritual leader, Father Creedon had become part of Ethel and Ted Kennedy's social circles, and he was a regular at special Kennedy family events, holidays, and parties. Just a week before the Lion of the Senate died from a brain tumor in August of 2009, Creedon had the pleasure, he said, of celebrating Mass with him. And during those last days, when he was visiting the dying Ted Kennedy, Creedon had stayed at Hickory Hill with Ethel. Chapter 28. Another Bride. Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s beloved Hudson River was the setting for his second marriage to his new beloved, Mary Richardson, a New York architectural designer who had been a Kennedy family disciple, groupie, some who knew her would call her, from the time that she was a teenager. Just 21 days after securing his quickie Dominican Republic divorce, and almost a year after proposing marriage, 42-year-old Bobby wed his 34-year-old girlfriend, who was 6 months pregnant. The ceremony took place aboard the Hudson River Keepers research vessel, the Shannon, on Income Tax Day, Friday, April 15, 1994. Like Bobby, his new bride came from a sprawling Catholic family. She had 6 siblings, so there was a Roman Catholic Mass, followed by the marriage ceremony, officiated by a New York State Supreme Court judge, Donald N. Silverman. The jurist wasn't selected at random. Bobby had campaigned for Silverman's judgeship in the past, and the two had an affiliation at Pace University Law School. When he got home to Westchester after the ceremony, Silverman told his wife that the Kennedy ceremony, which he thought would be a big, glittery affair, was, quote, bare bones on a barge, she recalled years later after her husband had died. Just a handful witnessed Bobby's second betrothal, including his 2 children from his marriage to Emily, 9-year-old RFK III and 6-year-old Kick. Afterwards, there was a picnic lunch on board with some friends and family members. It was almost as if Bobby's bride had been born a Kennedy. She'd practically become a member of the family in her mid-teens, a couple of years after her father, a professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, died of colon cancer. Mary, whose mother was a public school English teacher, was a student at Putney, an ultra-liberal co-ed boarding school in Vermont, where she became friends with Bobby's sister Carrie, the 7th of RFK and Ethel's 11. Bobby once claimed to the New York Times that Mary, after her father's death, had run away from home for 6 months, joining a puppet theater group. It was a bizarre thing to say, since Mary was only 12 when Professor Richardson died. In fact, her only connection to puppetry was as a small child, when she and some of her siblings worked summers at the Bread and Puppets Theater Group in Vermont. It was a mystery to some of those who knew Mary as to why Bobby would even make up such a story. After Mary and Carrie bonded, Mary spent practically every weekend and every vacation with the RFK branch of the Kennedy family, and the 2 women remained lifelong friends. After graduating from Putney, where Mary was, quote, the smartest student, according to Carrie, both girls went to Brown University, where they roomed together and where Mary got straight A's. Later, she was a top student at the Rhode Island School of Design. The 2 continued to room together until they were 30 years old, when Carrie married a scion of the powerful Cuomo political dynasty 4 years before Bobby wed Mary. We were inseparable, Carrie recalled. We shared friendships, a closet, a cash card. People couldn't tell our voices apart. When Bobby's brother Joe started his heating oil for the poor business, Citizens Energy, in Boston, Mary, who was then just 17, designed the company's first annual report, along with the firm's logo. When Joe ran for Congress the first time, Mary was active in his campaign. As part of her volunteer work, she solicited restaurants to donate fancy foods for the Election Day celebration. She also volunteered to help the RFK Center for Justice and Human Rights. And all of this was years before she even had a single romantic thought about Bobby, who was usually off chasing other women. Glamorous, sophisticated, Creatively talented and single, Mary had become part of the pop artist Andy Warhol's hip downtown scene, which included such Kennedys as Bobby and his cousin John Jr. Mary worked for a time for Andy Warhol, and when Ted Kennedy was running for the presidency in 1980, she conceived of a way to raise funds for him, Artists for Kennedy. She got the likes of Robert Rauschenberg, Roy Lichtenstein, and Julian Schneibel to donate, along with everyone else who walked through the doors of the factory, Warhol's downtown headquarters. At age 20, she raised millions, Carey later said. In Warhol's gossipy diary, edited and published posthumously in 1989, all 839 pages of it, there were about a dozen mentions of Mary, as well as men in whom she had shown a romantic interest, none of them a Kennedy. One was John Stockwell Samuels IV, a good-looking Harvard student who also modeled and was a platinum member of Warhol's circle. He had posed in Interview magazine and was commissioned to model by Armani. Moreover, he had run around with the Nicaraguan beauty Bianca Jagger, Mick's wife, and was part of the young Kennedy circle. But the Richardson girl had eyes for him. Warhol had noted in his diary that he and some other swells, including Bianca Jagger, were all supposed to meet at a fancy Manhattan restaurant for a late dinner. Mary Richardson had called, Warhol wrote, and I guess I was hinting that she wanted me to invite John Samuels, but I didn't get the hint. It was confusing. Everyone was playing different games. In the summer of 1980, Mary, along with Carey Kennedy and Bobby's brother Michael's future wife, Vicki Gifford, daughter of the NFL star Frank Gifford, were together in Monte Carlo, where Warhol had a showing and where the girls and the artist ogled Sylvester Stallone, who, according to Warhol, was dressed all in white and he looked really beautiful. The next day, Warhol wanted to introduce Mary and Carey to Grace Kelly's son, Prince Albert, but he wasn't interested. Back in New York, Mary had become friends with Warhol's business manager, Fred Hughes, and along with the artist, they attended a glitzy party at Manhattan's chic Le Club, where there was a celebration in honor of Michael Kennedy and Vicki Gifford's upcoming wedding. The paparazzi were out in force because a gaggle of Kennedys were in attendance. Gene Kennedy Smith, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, JFK Jr., and his sister Caroline. Only Jackie and Ted were missing, Warhol noted, adding in his diary that Bobby gave the best speech. He said, "He'll probably be better than Teddy. He'll probably be the one," meaning the president. Carey wrote some songs, and they all sang them. Mary kissed all the boys. She knew them all. Afterward, Mary, Carey, Fred Hughes, and Warhol, and a bunch of boys took a limo to a party being thrown by Calvin Klein and Elton John. At a Christmas party in 1980, Fred Hughes had brought Mary and one of Bobby's cousins. Warhol wrote in his diary, quote, "I was taking pictures of this handsome kid I thought was a model, and then I was embarrassed because it turned out to be John Kennedy. While Mary knew and liked JFK Jr., she never dated him." In the summer of 1981, Mary, according to Warhol, was looking for work, modeling work, apparently, and Warhol had arranged for her to have a meeting with his friend, the designer, who went by the name of Halston. He had made his name and fame as the premier fashion designer of all America, according to Newsweek, when he conceived the famous pillbox hat for Bobby's Aunt Jackie that she wore at his uncle's inauguration. Instead of showing up for the meeting, however, Mary had lunch with another popular designer, Bill Blass. Andy Warhol was miffed, writing that Blass, quote, was going to pay her $500 an hour to model, and so she was thrilled about that and wasn't even going to see Halston after I'd gone to all the trouble of getting her the appointment. In the spring of 1982, Warhol ran into Mary and she told him that she was going to marry a close friend of John Samuels, one Carlos Mavrolian, who had been Samuels' roommate at Harvard. Mavroleon was the son of a wealthy Greek shipping tycoon, Manuel Basil Bluey Mavroleon, who had settled in England and whose wealth was on a par with that of Aristotle Onassis. One of Bluey's 4 wives was a granddaughter of Somerset Maugham. Carlos's mother was a Mexican socialite, and his brother, Nicholas Mark Nicky Mavroleon, had been one of 3 husbands of the Nicaraguan-American actress Barbara Carrera, best known for playing a seductive Bond girl in the 007 movies. If Bobby's Aunt Jackie could marry a Greek shipping mogul, the gorgeous and confident Mary Richardson figured so could she, or at least the mogul's son. While Mary never compared herself to Mrs. Onassis, she did fall in love with Mavroleon. But it wasn't his wealth that had attracted her. She truly loved him. Mavroleon was close to the Richardson family, and Mary and Mavroleon had what a friend described as a deep and passionate relationship, a real and strong intimacy. They had, in fact, talked marriage, but the seriousness of that talk was anybody's guess. Warhol was surprised by Mary's claim of intending to marry Carlos, who had been educated at Princeton and Harvard and was close to the Kennedys, especially Bobby, as he was to the Richardsons. Mainly, Warhol was surprised because he had detected in Carlos a minor speech impediment that Warhol had linked stereotypically to effeminate homosexuals. "It'd be funny," he remarked, "if he was a straight person with a lisp, but I didn't know." Mavroleon wasn't gay, and Mary Richardson actually did have an intense relationship with him in the early 1980s when he was working on Wall Street and doing a lot of cocaine and any other drug he could procure. His brother recalled that when Carlos was having a good time, he just wanted to get high. In many ways, he was a fast-moving, smooth operator, like the character played by Leonardo DiCaprio in The Wolf of Wall Street, even down to the slicked-back hair and the $2,000 suits, but very bright and sophisticated. Besides dating Bobby Kennedy's future second wife, Mavroleon also was involved briefly with a blonde Barbie doll-like secretary by the name of Fawn Hall. She had made headlines in the 1980s when she became embroiled in the infamous Iran-Contra scandal while working for Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North at the National Security Council in Washington. Later, when she was married to the former manager of the Doors and living in the Hollywood Hills, she reportedly became addicted to crack cocaine and had to go into rehab after an overdose. While Fawn Hall survived her addiction, Carlos Mavroleon didn't. The 40-year-old heir to a fortune of more than $100 million was found dead in August 1998 of a heroin overdose in a dumpy $15 a night hotel room in a town near the Afghanistan border. His brother remarked in the wake of the tragedy that Carlos did drugs like some people took a drink. When word filtered back about his sudden death, Ethel Kennedy, who had much experience with sons on drugs, was said to have called the Clinton White House to get details of what had happened to Mavroleon, whom she adored. Mavroleon had been, as the Observer newspaper in London later reported on his life and death, quote, a war correspondent, a Wall Street broker, a lover of glamorous women from glamorous political dynasties, the Kennedys, and from less glamorous ones. With his money and connections, he was soon mixing with the best of America's East Coast society. He was a favored guest of the Kennedy clan. And I think I'm going to wrap this episode right there at the end of Chapter 28. In the next episode, Episode 14, we'll get into Chapter 29 and that turbulent and tragic decade of the 1990s, which was a really bad decade for the Kennedy family and for Bobby as well. So we will get into that next time on The Dark Side of RFK Jr. We are reading, I hope you'll get a copy of this book because I'm not reading the whole thing. There's a lot more stories to be told, and you should read a copy for yourself. Pick one up. It's by Jerry Oppenheimer, the New York Times best-selling author. This one's called Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream. So until next time, take care. I'll see you then. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.